The Mathematics of Unintended Consequences. August 22nd, 1942. 0700 hours. United States Pacific Fleet Headquarters, Pearl Harbor. Commander Thomas Whitlock, Naval Intelligence Analyst, 3rd Class, sat at his desk reviewing the preliminary after-action report from the Makin Island operation, his coffee growing cold in the humid morning air. The raid had killed 83 Japanese soldiers and destroyed installations and seaplanes. A success by any tactical measure. He circled the casualty figure with his pencil and wrote "excellent ratio" in the margin. What Commander Whitlock didn't know was that this single operation would fundamentally transform Japanese defensive strategy across the Pacific, turning every subsequent amphibious assault into a bloodbath that would cost tens of thousands of American lives. The initial reports were everything the planners had hoped for. 222 Marines launched from submarines. First time in history such an operation had been attempted. Enemy installations destroyed. Communications disrupted. Japanese forces killed at better than a 3-to-1 ratio, considering American casualties. Whitlock had advocated for exactly this kind of aggressive action. Raids to keep the Japanese off balance while the campaign for Guadalcanal developed. He picked up his telephone to call Captain Morrison in operations. "Tom, the Makin numbers look good. We should start planning the next one." But there was something in the final paragraph that gave him pause. Enemy garrison estimated at 43 personnel prior to raid. Full company strength, approximately 150 men, now being deployed to Makin Atoll. He read it again. A full company to defend an atoll that had been held by a platoon. That was, what, more than 3 times the original garrison? For an island with no strategic value? He set down his coffee cup. They must be panicking, he thought. Good. Let them waste troops on every rock in the ocean. What he didn't yet understand was that they weren't panicking. They were adapting, and their adaptation would be perfect. The mathematics were staggering, though it would take months for anyone to calculate them. Before the Makin raid, the Japanese defended hundreds of scattered islands and atolls across the Pacific with minimal forces, garrison sizes averaging between 30 and 60 men each. After Makin, the average garrison size would climb to 150 men, then 300, then for critical positions, over 1,000. The transformation represented not just a tripling or quadrupling of defensive forces, but a fundamental shift in Japanese strategic doctrine. Where they had once accepted that some islands might be raided, they now insisted that every position must be held to the death with maximum available force. The total reallocation represented over 50,000 additional troops diverted from offensive operations to static island defense. Troops that would have to be killed one by one in some of the most brutal fighting of the war. The scale was unprecedented in its perversity. American strategists had assumed that aggressive raids would force the Japanese to disperse their forces, making concentrations vulnerable to American counterattack. Instead, the opposite occurred. The raids convinced Japanese commanders that they could not afford any position to be weak. A garrison that might have surrendered when facing a platoon would fight to the last man when reinforced to company or battalion strength. An island that might have been bypassed became a fortress that had to be reduced. The mathematics of casualties shifted from hundreds to thousands for objectives that had no strategic value beyond the fact that they existed in the path of advance. Every Marine who would die on Tarawa, where nearly 5,000 Japanese defenders waited in prepared positions. Every soldier who would fall on Peleliu, where 11,000 Japanese troops turned an unnecessary battle into a 2-month nightmare, would be paying the price for the lesson Japan learned at Makin. 3 months earlier, Commander Whitlock had been among the most vocal advocates for exactly the kind of operation that had just been executed. He had 37 years old, 16 years in the Navy, with a master's degree in international relations from Princeton. He had served in the Asiatic Fleet before the war, had seen the Japanese military in China, and believed he understood their psychology. The Japanese, he had written in a memo that circulated through Pacific Fleet headquarters, respect strength and despise weakness. Aggressive action will convince them that every position is vulnerable, forcing dispersal of forces and defensive mentality. He had used the British raids on occupied Europe as his model. Hit them everywhere, make them garrison everything, spread them thin. The logic had seemed impeccable. Japan had conquered an enormous perimeter in 6 months, from the Aleutians to the Solomons, from Burma to the Gilbert Islands. Thousands of miles of ocean, hundreds of islands, dozens of major bases. They couldn't possibly defend it all in strength. Admiral Nimitz himself had approved the concept. "We need to make them react to us," the admiral had said in a planning meeting in late July. "Every soldier they put on an island garrison is a soldier they can't use at Guadalcanal." Whitlock had nodded in agreement. The mathematics seemed obvious. Disperse their forces, concentrate ours, win the decisive battles. The Makin raid had been planned as the first of many. The target was selected precisely because it was not strategically important. Just an atoll in the Gilbert Islands, occupied by a small Japanese garrison with a seaplane base and radio station. The goal was never to hold Macon, but to destroy the facilities, kill the garrison, and withdraw. Make the Japanese worry about every isolated post. Show them that nowhere was safe. Force them to strengthen garrisons everywhere, pulling troops from the main effort at Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, specially trained for exactly this kind of operation, would hit fast and withdraw. Submarines USS Nautilus and USS Argonaut would deliver them and extract them. A perfect demonstration of American aggressive spirit and Japanese vulnerability. Whitlock had even calculated the strategic benefit. If the raid forced Japan to increase the average garrison on unimportant islands from 50 to 100 men, and there were, say, 200 such positions across the Pacific, that would tie down 10,000 troops in static positions. 10,000 troops who couldn't be used offensively. 10,000 rifles pointed at empty ocean instead of at Marines trying to take Guadalcanal. The mathematics of it had been beautiful in its simplicity. He had presented it to the planning staff with confidence. They had agreed. The operation had been approved. The first hint that something was wrong came in late September, 6 weeks after the raid. Whitlock was reviewing intelligence summaries from coast watchers and reconnaissance flights across the Central Pacific when he noticed a pattern. On Mili Atoll, garrison strength estimated at 200, up from 60. On Maloelap, 350, up from 80. On Jaluit, 400, up from 120. He pulled out a map and marked each location. Every island in the Marshalls and Gilberts was being reinforced. Not just a little, massively. He felt the first flutter of unease in his stomach. He walked down the hall to intelligence collection and found Lieutenant Commander Sarah Matthews, who handled order of battle analysis. "Sarah, have you been tracking the garrison increases in the Marshalls?" She looked up from a pile of reports, her reading glasses halfway down her nose. She was 41, had been tracking Japanese force dispositions since before the war, and had a reputation for seeing patterns before anyone else. "Tom, it's not just the Marshalls. It's everywhere. The entire perimeter is being reinforced. I've been trying to figure out where they're getting the troops." She pulled out a chart covered in her neat handwriting. 5th Special Base Force, split up and distributed across the Central Pacific. Naval Guard forces being stripped from rear area duties and sent forward. Even seen some Army units being reassigned from occupation duty in China. They're pulling troops from everywhere to strengthen island garrisons. How many troops are we talking about? Conservative estimate? 30 to 40,000 men being redeployed from mobile reserve or offensive operations to static island defense. And that's just what we can confirm. Could be more. Whitlock felt something cold settle in his chest. 30 to 40,000. That wasn't dispersal of forces. That was fortification. When did this start? Immediately after Makin. We started seeing the movement orders within days. It's like someone flipped a switch. He returned to his office and pulled the file on the Macon raid. Read it again, carefully this time. The tactical success was undeniable. Carlson's Marines had stormed ashore, fought through heavy surf and alerted defenders, killed 83 enemy soldiers, destroyed 2 patrol boats, burned the seaplane base, and wrecked the radio station. 9 Marines had been left behind, couldn't evacuate in time, later executed by the Japanese. Tragic, but acceptable in the context of war. The raid had been hailed as a morale booster, proof that Americans could strike anywhere. President Roosevelt himself had praised the operation. Newsreels had played in theaters across the country. The raiders had become heroes. But what if the real effect was exactly the opposite of what they'd intended? What if instead of dispersing Japanese forces, they'd concentrated them? Instead of creating vulnerability, they'd created fortresses? Over the next month, the evidence accumulated like water rising behind a dam. Every intelligence report brought new confirmation. The Japanese were transforming their entire defensive perimeter. Not just increasing garrisons, but fundamentally changing how they defended territory. Naval Construction Battalion engineers were being sent to build fortifications. Artillery pieces were being emplaced in concrete bunkers. Supply stockpiles were being established to sustain long sieges. The transformation was systematic, thorough, and terrifying in its implications. In mid-October, a document was captured on Guadalcanal that changed everything. It was a directive from Admiral Yamamoto himself, dated August 23, 1942, one day after Whitlock had reviewed those initial positive reports on Makin. The translation came through on October 15th. Whitlock read it 3 times, feeling his stomach tighten with each reading. The enemy raid on Makin demonstrates the vulnerability of isolated garrisons to surprise attack. No position can be considered too remote to be threatened. All atoll and island garrisons must be reinforced to company strength minimum, battalion strength for strategic positions. Fortifications must be constructed to withstand naval bombardment and hold against sustained assault. Each position must be defended to the last man. The enemy must be made to pay in blood for every meter of ground. There it was, in black and white. The Makin raid hadn't dispersed Japanese forces. It had concentrated them. It hadn't created a defensive mentality. It had created a philosophy of fanatical resistance at every position. And it was Whitlock's logic, his memo, his strategic reasoning that had helped convince the planners to authorize the operation. He went to find Captain Morrison. The captain was in his office, reviewing operation plans for future amphibious assaults. "Sir, we need to talk about the garrison reinforcement pattern." Morrison looked up. He was 52, had been in the Navy since before the First World War, had a reputation for clear thinking. "I've seen the reports. The Japanese are strengthening positions. That's to be expected after they took a bloody nose at Makin. Sir, it's more than that. They're not just strengthening Makin, they're fortifying everything. And they're using a doctrine of no surrender. Fight to the last man. Every island is becoming a fortress. So we bypass them. island hopping, hit the weak spots, leave the strong ones to wither. Sir, there are no more weak spots. They're making every spot strong, and we can't bypass everything. Some positions we'll have to take because they control sea lanes or provide airfields. But now, instead of facing platoons, we'll be facing companies. Instead of companies, battalions. Instead of battalions, regiments. The casualty ratios are going to be terrible. Morrison set down his papers. You're saying the Macon raid was a mistake. I'm saying it had consequences we didn't anticipate. Strategic consequences. Tom, you were one of the ones who advocated for it. We all agreed. I know, sir. That's what worries me. The full scope of the disaster revealed itself slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical solution. In November, reconnaissance photos of Tarawa showed extensive fortification work underway. The atoll, which had been held by perhaps 500 Japanese troops in August, was now estimated to have over 4,000. Bunkers were being built from coconut logs and concrete. Artillery pieces were being emplaced in positions with interlocking fields of fire. The beach approaches were being strung with barbed wire and obstacles. Tarawa was being transformed from a minor outpost into a fortress. In December, a prisoner captured on New Georgia revealed the extent of the transformation. Seaman First Class Takeshi Yamada, 23 years old, from Osaka, had been assigned to a construction battalion sent to fortify Mili Atoll. Whitlock attended the interrogation, watching through a one-way mirror as the translator worked. They told us that the Americans would try to raid every island, Yamada said, his voice matter-of-fact. They showed us what happened at Macon, showed us pictures of the destroyed buildings, the dead soldiers. The commander said we would not let this happen again. Every position would be strong enough to hold until reinforcements arrived. Strong enough to make the Americans pay a price so high they would think twice before attacking. How many men were at Mili? The interrogator asked. When I arrived in September, maybe 70, 80 men. When I left in November, over 300. More coming. They were building bunkers, gun positions, everything. They said Mili would never fall to a raid. Would never fall at all. Whitlock felt sick. They had poked the dragon, and the dragon had responded by covering itself in armor. Not just at Macon, not just at the sites that had been raided, but everywhere. The entire defensive perimeter was hardening like concrete setting in the sun. And every bunker, every artillery piece, every reinforced garrison meant more American casualties when the time came to take these positions. The human dimension of the transformation became clear through intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations throughout early 1943. Japanese soldiers were being indoctrinated with a new defensive philosophy. An intercepted letter from a soldier on Kwajalein, written in January 1943, captured the mentality. Mother, they have told us what we must do if the Americans come. There will be no surrender. We will fight from our bunkers until our ammunition is gone. Then fight with bayonets. Then fight with our hands. Each man must kill at least 10 Americans before he dies. The raid on Macon showed what happens when a garrison is weak. We will not be weak. The Americans will drown in their own blood before they take this island. 10 Americans for every Japanese. The mathematics of that doctrine, multiplied across hundreds of fortified positions, was staggering. The Japanese had learned exactly the wrong lesson from Macon. Or perhaps from their perspective, exactly the right lesson. Don't let any position fall easily. Make every attack cost more than the objective is worth. Turn the Pacific into an ocean of blood. By March 1943, Whitlock had assembled a complete analysis of the strategic consequences. He worked late into the night, correlating intelligence reports, estimating garrison strengths, calculating the probable cost of future operations. The numbers were devastating. Before Makin, the total Japanese garrison forces across the Central Pacific totaled approximately 15,000 men, spread across dozens of positions, with most garrisons under 100 men. After Makin, that number had swollen to over 60,000 men, with many garrisons exceeding 300 men and critical positions holding over 1,000. The increase represented a shift of 45,000 troops from mobile forces to static defense. But more than the numbers, it was the philosophy that had changed. Before Makin, Japanese commanders had accepted that some positions might be raided or even captured. After Makin, every position became sacred ground, to be defended to the death. The doctrine of no surrender, which had been present in Japanese military culture but not universally applied, became absolute. Every bunker became a tomb that Marines would have to enter to kill the defenders. Whitlock calculated the probable cost of just one operation, the eventual assault on Tarawa. The pre-Makin garrison of 500 could have been overcome with perhaps 200 to 300 American casualties. The post-Makin garrison of over 4,000, fighting from prepared fortifications with orders to resist to the death, would require, he estimated, at least a 3-to-1 attacker-to-defender ratio in forces, and would likely inflict at least 15 to 20% casualties on the attacking force. If they sent 10,000 Marines against Tarawa, they should expect 2,000 casualties. 2,000 casualties to take an atoll that 6 months earlier might have cost 200. He wrote it all up in a classified report. 27 pages of analysis with detailed statistics, intelligence summaries, and projections. The conclusion was inescapable. The Makin raid, while tactically successful, appears to have triggered a fundamental shift in Japanese defensive strategy that will significantly increase the cost of future amphibious operations. Enemy forces that might previously have been bypassed or overwhelmed with minimal casualties are now being fortified to a degree that will require extensive preliminary bombardment and sustained assault to reduce. The strategic benefit of the raid, diversion of enemy attention from Guadalcanal, has been outweighed by the strategic cost of teaching the enemy that aggressive defense of all positions is necessary. He sent it up through channels. Captain Morrison read it and called him in. "Tom, this is a hell of an indictment." "It's what the intelligence shows, sir." "You're saying we made things worse." "I'm saying we changed their defensive strategy in a way that benefits them more than us. We wanted them to disperse their forces. Instead, we taught them to fortify everything." The raid was approved at the highest levels. The President praised it. "I know, sir. I advocated for it myself. But that doesn't change what happened afterward." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "I'll send it up. But Tom, there's going to be pushback. Nobody wants to hear that a successful operation had negative strategic consequences." The pushback came hard and fast. Within a week, Whitlock was called to a meeting with Admiral Spruance's staff. He presented his analysis to a room full of officers who ranged from skeptical to hostile. A colonel from Marine Corps operations slammed his hand on the table. "You're telling me that because we killed 83 Japanese and destroyed their installations, we somehow made things harder for ourselves? That's defeatist thinking, Commander." "I'm not saying the raid didn't achieve its tactical objectives. I'm saying the strategic response from Japan has been to fortify every position to a degree that will make future operations more costly. They were going to fortify anyway. They're losing. Desperate people build forts." "Sir, the timing is too precise. The reinforcement orders went out immediately after Makin." The doctrine of no surrender was codified in directives that explicitly reference the Macon raid as the lesson learned. A Navy captain from War Plans spoke up. Even if what you're saying is true, what's the alternative? We sit back and let them think we can't strike anywhere? That we're afraid to raid their positions? I'm not advocating for not taking action. I'm suggesting we need to consider whether pinprick raids that we don't intend to hold have strategic value that justifies teaching the enemy to defend everything to the death. The meeting ended without resolution. Whitlock's report was acknowledged but not acted upon. The machine of war had momentum, and changing course based on uncomfortable analysis was not something military institutions did easily or quickly. But the evidence kept mounting. Through the spring and summer of 1943, intelligence continued to show massive reinforcement and fortification efforts across the Pacific. By August, exactly 1 year after the Macon raid, the transformation was complete. The Japanese had turned their island perimeter into a network of fortresses. Small garrisons had become large garrisons. Open beaches had become killing zones. Simple defenses had become complex networks of bunkers and fighting positions. In September 1943, Whitlock received a letter from a friend, Major Robert Henderson, who had been with the 2nd Marine Division training for the Tarawa assault. They had served together before the war, had stayed in touch. Henderson wrote with brutal honesty, "Tom, we're training for something that's going to be hell. The intelligence on Tarawa is terrifying. Over 4,000 Japanese dug into concrete bunkers with artillery, machine guns, and orders to fight to the death. The Navy says they'll bombard it for days before we go in. But I've seen the fortifications in the recon photos. Some of those bunkers could take a direct hit from a battleship and still be operational. We're going to wade ashore into interlocking machine gun fire from positions that won't surrender until we kill every man in them. The casualty estimates are over 3,000. 3,000 casualties for an atoll that's 1 square mile. I keep thinking about what you told me last year, about how the Macon raid changed everything. If you're right, if that raid taught them to defend like this, then every one of my Marines who dies at Tarawa is paying for that lesson. I hope you're wrong, Tom, but I'm afraid you're right." Whitlock kept that letter in his desk drawer. He would read it during the long nights when he couldn't sleep, when the weight of his own role in advocating for the Macon raid pressed down on him like a physical force. He had believed he understood strategy. He had believed that aggressive action would create strategic advantage. He had been wrong, and Marines were going to die because of it. The Tarawa assault came in November 1943, 15 months after Macon. Whitlock followed the reports as they came in, each one worse than the last. The preliminary bombardment, the heaviest yet attempted in the Pacific, failed to destroy the fortifications. Marines waded ashore into devastating fire. The beach became a slaughterhouse. Men drowned in the deep water when their landing craft struck the coral reef. Men burned in vehicles hit by artillery. Men died trying to cross the beach against machine guns, firing from bunkers that refused to be suppressed. It took 76 hours to secure the island. 3,000 Americans were killed or wounded, exactly as Henderson had predicted. Over 4,000 Japanese defenders died, most of them killed in their bunkers, fighting to the last man. The casualty ratio was nearly 1-to-1, unheard of in amphibious operations. And Tarawa was just the beginning. The pattern would repeat at Kwajalein, at Saipan, at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa. Every fortified position would have to be reduced the hard way, bunker by bunker, position by position, at terrible cost. Major Henderson survived Tarawa, but barely. He was wounded twice, saw his platoon reduced to 8 men from 42. He wrote to Whitlock in December, "You were right. Every one of those bunkers, every Japanese with orders to die in place, every fortification that made us pay in blood, that all started with Makin. They learned that raids work, so they made sure raids would never work again. They made sure nothing would work without paying a terrible price. We killed over 4,000 Japanese at Tarawa, Tom. We lost 3,000 Americans. And for what? An atoll that's barely big enough to build an airfield. An airfield we needed because all the other islands between here and Japan are just as fortified. It's going to be like this all the way to Tokyo. Every island a fortress. Every fortress bought with blood." The psychological transformation Whitlock underwent during those months of evidence accumulation was profound. He went through stages that he later recognized as similar to grief. First, denial. The reinforcement must be coincidence, must be planned before Macon, must be response to other factors. He spent weeks trying to find alternative explanations, trying to prove that his analysis was wrong. But the evidence was relentless. The timeline was too precise, the doctrinal changes too explicit, the scale too comprehensive. Then doubt. Maybe he was seeing patterns that weren't there. Maybe he was giving too much credit to a single raid. Maybe the Japanese would have fortified anyway. But the captured documents kept referring to Macon. The interrogated prisoners kept mentioning the raid as the catalyst. The timing kept aligning too perfectly. Then acceptance. He had been wrong. The Macon raid had not achieved its strategic objective. Instead, it had taught the Japanese a lesson that would cost thousands of American lives. The mathematics he had been so confident about had been inverted. Instead of dispersing Japanese forces, the raid had concentrated them. Instead of creating vulnerability, it had created strength. Instead of making island defenses weaker, it had made them impossible to overcome without massive casualties. With acceptance came the crushing recognition of implication. Every future amphibious assault would be more costly because of Macon. Every Marine who died storming a fortified beach was, in some small way, paying for the lesson Japan had learned. Whitlock would lie awake at night, calculating. If his analysis was right, if Macon had triggered this defensive transformation, then the 45,000 additional Japanese troops now in fortified positions would inflict, at the ratios seen at Tarawa, perhaps 30 to 40,000 additional American casualties over the course of the war. 30 to 40,000 casualties that might not have happened if Macon had never been raided. He couldn't undo what had been done. The Macon raid was history. The Japanese defensive transformation was complete. But he could try to change how future operations were planned. He wrote memo after memo, advocating for a shift in strategy. Bypass fortified positions whenever possible. Use the mobility of the fleet to avoid strength and hit weakness. Never raid an objective you don't intend to hold unless the strategic benefit clearly justifies teaching the enemy to fortify everything else. Some of his recommendations were adopted. The island hopping strategy that emerged in late 1943 and 1944 did bypass many fortified positions, leaving them to wither. But many others could not be bypassed. They controlled essential sea lanes or provided necessary airfields or were judged too dangerous to leave in the rear. And every one of those positions had to be taken by direct assault against defenders who had learned at Macon that they must never surrender, that every position must be defended to the last man, that making the Americans pay in blood was the only way to make the cost of victory too high to bear. The final irony emerged years later. in the captured Japanese records and post-war interrogations. Admiral Yamamoto's directive, the one that had transformed Japanese defensive strategy, had been opposed by some of his subordinates. They argued that concentrating forces in static defenses was exactly what the Americans wanted, that mobile reserves and offensive operations were more valuable than fortified garrisons. But Yamamoto had been convinced by Macon that the Americans could strike anywhere, and that meant everywhere had to be defended. The raid that was supposed to make the Japanese disperse their forces had instead convinced their senior commander to concentrate them in the worst possible way, from the American perspective. In 1951, Whitlock attended a reunion of Pacific War veterans at the Marine Corps base in Quantico. He was 56 now, retired from the Navy, teaching at Georgetown. He ran into Henderson, who had stayed in the Marines, now a colonel. They walked through the base museum, looking at exhibits from the island campaigns. They stopped in front of a display about Tarawa. Photos of Marines wading ashore, of burning landing craft, of the terrible beach. A plaque listed the casualties: 3,176 Americans killed or wounded, 4,719 Japanese killed. Henderson stared at the numbers for a long time. You know what the hell of it is, Tom. They were right, in a way. Every one of those Japanese who died in their bunkers, fighting to the last round. They did make us pay. They did make it cost more than anyone thought it would. If they'd defended the way they did before Macon, if they'd had smaller garrisons that would surrender when the position became hopeless, we'd have lost far fewer men taking these islands. But Macon taught them that Americans could strike anywhere. So they had to make everywhere strong. And strong meant casualties. Lots of casualties. I'm sorry, Whitlock said. I advocated for that raid. I thought it was good strategy. We all did. Hell, I thought it was brilliant when I first heard about it. Submarine-launched raiders hitting them where they least expect it. Classic special operations. But strategy isn't about tactics. It's about what happens after the tactics. It's about how the enemy responds. And they responded by making sure it would never be that easy again. They walked on, past displays of other battles, other casualties, other islands bought with blood. The pattern was consistent. After Macon, the cost went up, way up. The mathematics of amphibious warfare shifted from attacker advantage to defender advantage, from quick victories to prolonged slaughter, from acceptable casualties to appalling casualties. In the final exhibit room, there was a wall dedicated to the Macon raid itself. Photos of the raiders, of Lieutenant Colonel Carlson, of the submarines. A plaque describing the operation. August 17 to 18, 1942. 222 Marines raid Japanese-held Macon Atoll. 83 Japanese killed, installations destroyed. 9 Marines executed after capture. The raid boosted American morale and demonstrated the ability to strike Japanese positions anywhere in the Pacific. Henderson read the plaque and shook his head. That's what the official history says. Boosted morale. Demonstrated capability. What it doesn't say is that it taught the Japanese to turn every island into Tarawa. Doesn't say that it added thousands of names to the casualty lists on islands that could have been taken more easily. History remembers the tactics. It forgets the consequences. Whitlock stood before the plaque for a long time. The smiling faces of the raiders looked back at him from a photograph. Young men, confident, aggressive, ready to take the war to the enemy. They had done exactly what they'd been trained to do. They had done it well. They had succeeded. But their success had set in motion a chain of consequences that no one had foreseen. consequences that would echo across the Pacific in the form of bunkers and bodies, fortifications and funeral. A defensive transformation that turned every subsequent amphibious assault into an exercise in attrition warfare. The universal truth that Whitlock extracted from the Macon experience was this. In strategic warfare, tactical success means nothing if it teaches the enemy a lesson that makes future operations more difficult. The purpose of military action is not to win battles, but to create conditions for victory. Macon won a battle, but created conditions that made victory more costly. The raid succeeded brilliantly at everything it set out to do, except the one thing that mattered. It was supposed to make the war easier to win, and instead, it made the war harder to win. The principle extended beyond military affairs. Any competitive action, any aggressive move, any demonstration of strength must be evaluated not just on immediate results, but on how the opponent will respond. A company that raids a competitor's market share might trigger defensive reactions that make future expansion more difficult. A political party that wins by aggressive tactics might trigger countermeasures that make governance harder. A nation that demonstrates its capability to strike anywhere might teach its adversaries that everywhere must be defended, turning every future engagement into a costly struggle. The Macon raid remains in the histories as a bold, successful operation. The first submarine-launched Marine raid, a morale booster at a dark time in the war. And it was all of those things. But it was also a strategic error that cost thousands of lives and made every amphibious assault from Tarawa to Okinawa more difficult and more costly than it might have been. The raiders who participated were heroes. The planners who authorized it were doing their best with the information available. But the consequences were tragic, and the lesson was clear. Sometimes the best way to win is to think not just about what your action will accomplish, but about what it will teach your enemy to do in response. Commander Whitlock, who had advocated so confidently for aggressive raids, who had calculated so carefully the benefits of dispersing enemy forces, who had believed so firmly that he understood the strategic implications of the operation, lived with the knowledge of what Macon had unleashed. Every casualty report from every fortified island was a reminder. Every bunker that had to be reduced with flamethrowers and demolition charges was teaching the lesson again. The mathematics of unintended consequences. The price of tactical success. The difference between winning a raid and winning a war. In his final years, teaching at Georgetown, Whitlock would use Macon as a case study. Not to assign blame, not to criticize the raiders or the planners, but to illustrate the fundamental principle of strategic thinking. Actions have consequences beyond their immediate results. Students would ask, "But Professor, if you'd known then what you know now, what should have been done differently?" And he would answer, "That's the wrong question. The right question is, what assumptions did we make that turned out to be wrong? We assumed aggressive action would disperse enemy forces. We assumed raids would create a defensive mentality. We assumed making them react would give us the initiative. Every one of those assumptions inverted under contact with reality. The lesson isn't that the raid was bad. The lesson is that strategic analysis requires thinking through how the enemy will respond, and being humble enough to accept that our models of their behavior might be completely wrong." The mathematics were indeed staggering. 83 Japanese killed at Macon, 9 Marines executed. Tactical success. But 45,000 Japanese troops diverted to fortified island garrisons. 30 to 40,000 additional American casualties over the course of the war. Strategic failure. The numbers didn't lie. Sometimes the bravest, most aggressive, most tactically successful operation can set in motion consequences that echo across a theater of war. turning every subsequent battle into a harder fight, every victory into a more costly achievement, every step toward the ultimate goal into a wade through blood that might have been avoided. The Macon Island raid succeeded brilliantly, and in succeeding, it helped ensure that thousands of Americans would die taking islands that might have fallen more easily. Fighting enemies who had learned that the only way to make aggression too costly was to make every position a fortress and every defender a fanatic. That was the paradigm shift that Commander Whitlock discovered. Too late to change, too important to forget, too painful to ever fully accept. The raid worked. And because it worked so well, it made everything afterwards so much harder.